Chapter 11. First Battle. Havaliah's ears had always been sensitive. The training exercises had held to a point, but they all jumped the instant reality had become apparent. Someone was trying to kill them. Something they could deal with. Something they knew was evil, and they could cut or crush with as much forethought as cutting a piece of bread. They broke formation and drove themselves behind the nearest rock. Taking occasional glances up and seeing human outlines, they both exchanged glances at each other in panic and not understanding why. Daniel took a few short breaths and closed his eyes to pull himself back into the habits their training had set. Gideon's expression was hidden behind his visor, but his body language suggested that he didn't want to be there. Havaliah was overwhelmed by the noise and couldn't get her voice to carry over the thunderclaps of dust rocketing around her. Dust. Dust! Daniel! He was aware of the fact she was talking, but couldn't hear her. He was tapping his scroll for some reason. Then finally she began to think clearly again. Kicking herself for panicking, she remembered the communications devices in their pockets and started yelling into it, even though they were barely a few meters from each other. "They're shooting dust! Are you ready to try this?" Daniel's eyes widened slightly as he shrugged. It was as good a response as any. He stood up with his hammer in hand and began running straight into their firing line. The moment she heard him groan, she shared a glance with Gideon, and they both began to instinctively run around the other direction. A mental note was taken at where Olivia had gone, and she began turning her mind back to how they had drilled this before. Her mind attempted to cope with the continuous noise by thinking of something she was familiar with. She began muttering mathematical formulas and forming a makeshift lecture to herself, explaining how this maneuver was just like one of the formulas. She stifled a laugh when Olivia's impressions came to mind, impersonating the instructor. Before she knew it, they had reached where they needed to and started looking for Olivia's signal. Gideon pointed out some rocks, deliberately rolling over the gelatinous mark her egg had left, and took that as their cue. Daniel's groans continued to draw concern from Gideon, who chose to take the right approach. Havaliah continued to move between the rocks and building up her heart rate to prepare herself next time and make sure she didn't find herself put into a state of panic again. "We're not killing, we're catching," she repeated to herself again and again, while keeping in mind local criminals they had subdued for volunteer hours. Gideon gave a brief glance left, and they split once again, jumping into the fray. Daniel was in agony, yet he continued moving forward. The impact and the flares of attention his body was drawing to injuries his semblance kept from forming made all but the most basic of instincts impossible to act on. He couldn't think, he couldn't run, he could only act on what he had already decided needed to be done. Motivations and regrets would come later. There wasn't even fear. The pain kept him focused, and he continued to draw the fire. Various scores of burns were left on his armor of lightning, ice, and, most of all, fire. He clenched his teeth and focused every ounce of will he had to focus on where each blow was struck until finally it stopped. He began breathing heavily and dropped to his knee, allowing the adrenaline to abate from his system. "This never gets easier," he breathed with a slight chuckle and realized he still held his hammer. It had heated up considerably and his gloves were smoking. With a grin, his grip tightened and he drew himself up, pointing it at the nearest man who held wide eyes through his hood and mask. Only natural, given what he had just witnessed. Olivia took her time climbing the large rock where her egg had found purchase and left the mark her team would follow. Now that she had gone transparent, the attention of their target had only briefly been on her until the larger threat had warranted the focus of their weapons. She had already been beyond their sight the moment the mark had been made. The moment they opened fire, she began to climb, her small figure making finding footholds easier, but reaching into new handholds more difficult. As was her tendency in these situations, she made every effort to be as quiet and rigid as what was around her. This changed, however, once she reached the top of the stone. One of the mountain men had placed a large gun at the top of the rock. Her head tilted when she saw the individual wielding it was everything his weapon wasn't. He was almost as short as she was and built in a very slender manner. Normally in these kind of situations, she'd just disable the target while she still had the drop on it. But this was the first time she actually had a chance to fight something smarter than a Grim. This could be a fun story for later. Taking a seat very gently next to him before she materialized and leaned over the moment his eyes rested onto a large glass on top of his gun, she grinned to herself and slapped the back of its head into the scope and screamed, "Surprise!" Momentarily dazed, he caught his rifle from falling down the rock, but had already lost his footing and knocking stones along the way, trying to gain purchase before he ended up killing himself. Olivia grabbed his ankle and started examining his shoe. "Ooh," Olivia cooed with a high-pitched tone. "I bet these are old. How'd you get up here? What's your name?" Switching to a gruff voice. "What's this mountain you guys keep talking about?" Confusion went to disgust the moment the man was aware of what was going on. He didn't reply to her and began straining to right himself as she continued. "I like those gloves, too. I bet they got you up here really fast. I like climbing. That's why I'm up here, too. We should exchange numbers. I'll tell you all about how I got up here. Then... Oh, but you don't have to take my word for it. I'm here now. Speaking of proof..." She shook him the moment the rifle barrel was almost pointed back up at her direction, and her tone grew instantly dark. "Why did you shoot a bomb at my school?" Holding her eyes for another moment, he snarled and pushed himself off the rock face with his foot and launched himself into what must have been 80 yards horizontally before he started to descend. Olivia's eyes were wide as she watched him land without injury. Eventually she blinked and mumbled to herself. "That explains how he got up here." She drew her bow and took up the position the man had earlier. Squirming a bit before getting comfortable, she eventually found a place to rest her weapon at an angle where it could be useful. Taking aim and frowning, she saw the man's rifle had fallen and shattered the moment he had let it go. She shook her head slightly and began taking in the environment before checking in with her team. They didn't have too many places to go, but it's still outside. That was an area of concern in of itself. She turned a moment to activate her scroll and set it to speaker so she could help coordinate. The signal was close enough to the school that it would hopefully reach them soon. The moment she had a grasp of their surroundings, her eyes went down to where the noises were loudest and grew wide when she saw Daniel getting shot. She reflexively began to rise and calm down again the moment she saw what was being shot. "Dust. That's gonna make him sore tomorrow." Her hand went over her mouth as she continued to endure it. She always admired his willingness to go to the most dangerous places so that others could be safe. It was never easy for her to watch. More and more activity made her nervous because it made her that much more responsible to keep track of. Thus far, she had counted 15 of them, including the jumper, and their weapons were all dust. This gave her some peace of mind since they were all focused away from Havaliah and Gideon. She smiled as Havaliah began showing off her acrobatic talents she had developed over the last few weeks. At times she had to admit to envy for her semblance. She simply didn't get tired, and it made her athletic abilities only limited by her willingness to spend time on them. She was nothing if not practical with the results. It kept them disoriented and certainly drew their attention. She ducked and wove between them and could see her elation as she used her knife to cut their weapons. Her eyes went to Gideon and saw him going towards Daniel to make sure he could recover. She smiled, knowing the two could always be counted on to take care of each other. A larger mountain man began moving towards them and finally gave her an excuse to get involved. A warning shot was fired and landed near enough to gain his attention. These moments not only instilled fear in their enemy, but brought encouragement to Gideon and Daniel as they knew she was there. Daniel's eyes were still down, which meant he needed more time. She'd trust Gideon to cover him until then. Activity drew her attention back to their point of escape and made her think they were falling back. She looked back to the other teams who were almost close enough to engage them and reached a signal to them on their scrolls. The moment her eyes went back, she saw it wasn't a retreat at all. A grim horde was approaching. The small team wasn't there to draw out the school's soldiers. It was to draw an army of monsters in. She knew she had little time and dropped everything to reach her scroll. She began slamming the emergency signal that went to every one of their scrolls. Of all the pranks she pulled, she never misused that resource. The instructor was the first to respond. Her eyes darted back and forth to the small group and the Grimm that were almost on top of her team at this point. "Olivia, what's wrong?" She was about to shout code black, informing him of an outright grim assault. However, words failed to come to her as she looked down again at the scene unfolding where Daniel and Gideon once stood. "You sent an emergency signal. What's happening? Olivia, respond." She stammered for an answer as her eyes tried to follow what was going on.
"It's Gideon, sir.
He cut her off before she could continue. "Get Havalaya and Daniel out of there, now. We're falling back. I'll be waiting when it's over." As fruitless a gesture as it was, she nodded and closed the connection. She gathered her weapon and began signaling Daniel and Havalaya's indents, hoping they would understand the signal. The particular ring would be unmistakable, but in the heat of combat, she worried they wouldn't notice. Her concern getting the best of her, she instead began sliding down towards the combat zone. Or at least, what was left of it.